Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. We're going to get underway in just a minute or so. We're just going to let everyone settle into their places before we get the lecture underway. But thank you for joining us. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 Maggie Nally Lecture, the flagship event for CIPR International. My name is Crispin Thorold. I'm the Vice Chair of CIPR International, a member of Council, and my day job is Strategic Communications Advisor for the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. It's a real honor to welcome you to this, the first Maggie Nally Lecture that has been held since 2019. And it promises to be a very special event. As you know, we have a truly exceptional speaker, but before we formally introduce Melissa Fleming, the Under-Secretary General for Global Communications at the United Nations, we must say a few words about Maggie Nally, after whom this event is named. Margaret Nally was born in 1922. She served in the war in the Wrens, the Royal Navy's women's service. And by the time she entered the public relations industry in 1955, she was mother to 3 children. From her kitchen table, Maggie Nally built her own business, what would now be known as a PR consultancy. And according to a Campaign magazine write-up on her appointment as president of the Institute in 1976, the first woman to hold the role, she claimed not to be a great women's libber. But despite her modesty, she was absolutely a pioneer for women in the communications and PR industry. One of her major goals as president was to bring about an attitude shift again amongst members to encourage them to view the Institute as a professional body rather than as a club. And it's a real credit to her memory that the professionalization of our industry is now central to everything that the CIPR does. We're really grateful to Maggie Nally's children, Denise and Patrick, for their continued interest and support of this event, and I think they're here with us today. Now, to our speaker today, Melissa Fleming, the Global Communications Lead at the UN. Like Maggie Nally, Melissa Fleming is a pioneer. She's a communications leader of great distinction who's held a series of roles at international public organizations that really transform the lives of people around the world. The title of her lecture will be Responsible Influence, PR in Times of Change. And to set the scene for this talk and to welcome Melissa Fleming on behalf of the Institute, we're joined now by our president, Steve Shepperson-Smith. Steve.
Thanks so much, Crispin. Thank you so much to CIPR International Group for inviting me to speak today. It's a great honor, actually. The Maggie Nally Lecture has been an institution for the CIPR for many years. And it was held every year from 2013 to 2003, even to 2019, as Crispin said. It was really important to me and the board to reintroduce it in the 75th anniversary of the CIPR because Maggie Nally has such an esteemed role in the history of the Institute as our first female president. And I had the great honor to speak to Denise, her daughter, last Friday, who said that she felt that it would mean a lot to her mum to have had this event reinstalled this year. So we're absolutely delighted to do that. And to do that with such a high-profile speaker is a fantastic thing to have. As Crispin mentioned, the Maggie Nally Lecture honours our first female president and underlines the important role of volunteers have played throughout our history and continue to play in supporting the very best practice in our industry. We're thinking back to 1948 this year when CIPR was founded, interestingly, just 3 years after the UN itself was founded. And the CIPR was founded because the British government of the day recognised the importance of citizens having trust in institutions. They were trying to rebuild their lives after the Second World War, and they needed to know that the information being related from those institutions, whether they were public or private bodies, could be trusted. So they invested in an institute for PR. They invested in having publicity officers for those organizations that were clearly trained and also committed to objective ethical standards. Today, CIPR has got over 11,000 members in 80 countries. And actually, it's great to be at a CIPR International event where we can have more of those people from those 80 countries taking part. And I know we've got over 300 people here today from around the world, which is fantastic. In 1948, trust in institutions was more of a given. That age of deference is well behind us. People back then, and obviously, I wasn't alive, but we're given to believe that people back then generally believed their governments, and if they didn't know something, they sought out expert opinions. In my country, one of our ministers in recent years has said nobody wants to listen to experts anymore, which is a terrifying thing. And certainly the age of deference is over in the UK, as it is, I know, in many other countries around the world. Today, as we'll be hearing from our speaker, Melissa Fleming, misinformation, disinformation have in fact reached such levels that the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is now calling for the world to address the grave global harm of hate and lies in the digital space. The UN has also observed that what they call dark and mainstream PR firms are key purveyors of misinformation and disinformation. That only demonstrates how relevant and essential the CIPR and our code of conduct are today. That mission that I outlined in 1948 is 75 years old and more relevant than ever. But it also demonstrates the vital role that a truly global organization like the United Nations has in leading us all towards a future where expertise and unsullied information on what our audiences seek and consume rather than the damaged ecosystem of today. So there could be little better speaker for us to reboot the Maggie Nally lecture than Melissa Fleming. And in fact, more so than just having her as a speaker, I also want to exclusively announce today that we're going to give Melissa Fleming the President's Medal for CIPR this year as well. Now, the President's Medal was founded in 1966. There's a list of those who've received it in the past on the website. There's some very illustrious people on that list that Melissa joins today. But it was really important because one of the key themes of the 75th anniversary has been the positive impact that PR can have on society. We hear a lot in media about the dark arts, about the negatives of PR. We know as an institute, we know as a membership that we are the good guys. And we're going out there every day to try and do better and to try and be the ethical conscience of the organizations we work for. There was no better, genuinely, and we looked around, there was no better example of an ethical conscience and someone who'd gone out there and worn her colors on her sleeve and fought for causes like refugees that are so important in this world than Melissa Fleming. So Melissa, we're absolutely delighted to give you that award and to welcome you to speak to us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Stephen. I'm deeply honored to receive the President's Award. It's and thank you for those kind words. I absolutely passionately believe that our profession is, as you mentioned, it's there for us to communicate on the common good. CIPR, it's been for 75 years, and happy 75th anniversary. As you outlined just now, been committed through its code of conduct to promoting the highest professional standards of our business, which is integrity and transparency. And it was really interesting to hear from you that the founders were thinking about promoting trust in institutions as part of the reason for creating CIPR, and how much we need that now, exactly as you said, as relevant today as ever. So do I give the floor back to you, Crispin? Thank you very much for this award. I am deeply, deeply honored, and it will give me more strength and passion and drive to continue on, communicating on behalf of refugees, on behalf of the world's most vulnerable people. And yeah, I'm really, really moved. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Stephen. Yes, I'm going to speak for just a moment because it's time to embarrass you a tiny little bit more before we go over to your lecture. But I think it's important that we run through some of the highlights of your career. Since 2019, Melissa has been the lead of global communications at the United Nations, and as Steve referred to there, previously and for a decade, she was the head of global communications at the UNHCR, of course, the UN Refugee Agency. She's also held communications leadership roles at the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, and at the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I wanted to reference particularly that Melissa's also a really skilled journalist. She's taken her communications into different formats, including as host of the award-winning Awake at Night podcast series that's currently recording season 8 as a must listen if you're interested in international affairs, and through her non-fiction book, A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea, that examines the refugee crisis through the real-life story of a Syrian girl who fled the country during the war. After her lecture, Melissa's going to be taking questions from you all. Please do add your questions to the chat as they occur to you throughout the event. We'll be looking at those as Melissa's speaking, and we'll be putting those to her after the lecture. And so now, without further ado, Melissa, if I can hand over to you, you'll be speaking to us today a reminder about responsible influence, PR in times of change. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen, and thanks again, Stephen, and thanks to all of you. It was really impressive to hear from how many countries you're all tuned in, I believe 80. And I know that this lecture was traditionally held in person, but this gives us the opportunity to reach more people perhaps, and to include more countries. And so really great to be here. And again, what a great honor to deliver this year's CIPR International Maggie Nally lecture. And I wanted to also just mention that we are celebrating a really important anniversary this year and at the United Nations. And it is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I say this because the human rights and values within that declaration are also as relevant and needed today as they were 75 years ago, and they also guide our advocacy work every day. The guiding message within is all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And it's just such a beautiful line, and it's one that we carry with us as we work every day. And my job at the UN is to communicate for these rights of people, but it's also to communicate about the state of our world. And our world is in crisis. We're facing multiple and cascading challenges. We're seeing authoritarianism on the march, and democracy increasingly in peril. A third of humanity lives in conflict areas. And climate change is already becoming an existential threat to many people. And beyond that, inequality is dividing our world into society and our societies into haves and have-nots in greater extremes than ever. And we're even facing a resurgent nuclear threat in some of the rhetoric that we are seeing, including around the Ukraine war. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic reversed years of progress that we had been making on the Sustainable Development Goals. And all of this is happening against a wider backdrop of rising online disinformation, misinformation, and hate. We have algorithms that prioritize engagement that have turned extremist views into the mainstream. Anti-Semitism normalized racism and other hate speech, and targeting the marginalized and stigmatizing people who are displaced. And obviously, this has huge impacts on human rights, which we're very concerned about in this 75th anniversary year in particular. One of the things that I'm really focused on as we in the UN are trying to work around the world to lift up societies, to protect human rights, and to promote equality, is that our information ecosystems are poisoned and toxic with the disinformation, conspiracies, and hate. And how can we improve the world, make progress when people are infected with information that is tearing societies apart and driving them to distrust the authoritative sources that are meant to inform and guide them. Media organizations that are our source for accurate, objective, and reliable information about the issues that matter are also facing extinction in many countries and even cities, including in richer countries. Freedom House has put out a recent estimate that just 13% of people around the world have access to a free press. And the remaining public interest media struggles to survive, with advertisers having shifted to social media. And we're also seeing social media organizations taking decisions to de-emphasize news in people's feeds. And that when 30% of people around the world say that they get their news from social media. So to make things worse, sorry about this, but surveys are showing that mounting news avoidance, that more and more people are turning away from the news because of all the gloom and doom, and a slumping trust in traditional media. And we know what happens next. Democracy falters, and corruption and ignorance thrive. And ultimately, human progress stalls. We are heading into a bumper election year in 2024, when more than 2 billion voters are eligible to go to the polls. And the concern is that these voters won't be responsibly informed to select the candidates who will act in their best interest. But believe it or not, I'm not here to depress you. I am convinced that our profession can change the world for the better. And, the antidote to all of this is accurate and authoritative information, trusted information that is delivered in the same feeds where mis and disinformation are circulating, and campaigns around our causes that, armed with facts, can also inspire people to care and also inspire people to get involved. And that is why our communication strategy at the UN revolves around 3 W's. The 5 W's of journalism are still in the background, but our 3 W's of cause UN communications are what, why care, and what now. What we communicate can educate the public around facts. How we communicate can elevate people around caring and compassion. And the solutions we offer can mobilize people around action. I want to kind of illustrate this in my own journey with communications, but also with disinformation over the years. And maybe I've been asked to kind of take a step back and kind of track this through my career. And my first workplace that Crispin didn't mention, but I started working for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty back during the Cold War times and in that transition. And then it was falsely described in the press as a CIA radio. At the OSCE, which I later served, hate speech led to the awful ethnic conflict in the Bosnia War, where neighbors killed neighbors and 8,000 men and boys were murdered because of being Muslim. And at the IAEA, stories were invented around weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. And all of this was a huge challenge for me as a spokesperson to counter. But this was all before the age of social media. So in 2015, fast forward, I was working for the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. And many of you will remember this because it was an iconic period in history. About 1 million refugees arrived in Europe. And I think we all saw on our television screens, in our newspapers, and in our social media feeds, the best of humanity. Posts of photographs of, signs welcoming refugees at train stations, teddy bears being offered to refugee children, marches through European cities saying refugees are welcome here. But then two things started to happen. Bad actors and opportunistic politicians made up stories online to frighten the public. These stories were very emotive, touched on certain fears, and in many cases went viral. And second, at the same time, people began to get overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the crisis. They began growing numb to the suffering of others. And social science will tell you this. This is a common occurrence when people are faced with large numbers of mass suffering or mass movements of people. But we were seeing this in real time. And it was around that time that I heard the saying that I carry with me all the time. And that is, statistics are human beings with the tears dried off. Sure enough, the welcome soured and votes and policies became more hostile. And I knew then that we had to really start changing our ways of communicating to cut through the noise and the numbing numbers, and also to change the narrative in the favor of humanity. We wanted people to be able to relate with the countless harrowing stories of people risking everything to flee for their lives, put themselves in their shoes. And so this is when I went on a quest for individual stories, to humanize those who were fleeing, and really as I said, to change the narrative about why people were leaving their homes, and what they could possibly contribute to the societies they were coming to. So I found a story that it was so remarkable and so telling of the entire refugee experience. Most of the refugees, as you recall, were coming from Syria. And I learned of the story of Doa, who was 19 years old at the time, a young Syrian teen refugee who had just been rescued off the Mediterranean Sea. She was driven by her home by the brutal war. She and her fiancé, Bassem, could not see a future where they were in exile in Egypt. And so they put their lives in the hands of smugglers to travel across the sea to Europe together with 500 others, crammed into an old fishing boat. And after 4 days at sea, the boat was rammed by another smuggler gang, and it sank. And many were killed instantly, and others hung on the wreckage to stay alive. After 2 days, the love of her life, her fiancé, lost his fight with the sea. And Doa, who couldn't swim and who was surviving on a child's floating ring, was left alone. Just a few other survivors, and looking after 2 tiny babies who had been entrusted to her by their dying relatives. She sang and she prayed with them as they drifted for another 2 days at sea. And at last, a merchant vessel rescued them from their ordeal. And of the 500 people, only Doa and one of the babies and a few others survived. One of the babies, Masa, survived with her. And Doa's extraordinary survival story captured not just my imagination, but when I started to tell it, first on the TED stage, where the talk received millions of views, and then in a book which I wrote, which is called A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea, which includes a young reader's edition that is being taught in schools, and it's been published in more than a dozen languages. This was proof to me, especially when, the comments from readers were, I never knew anything about refugees. Doa is my hero. How can I learn more about the situation of the plight of refugees? What my government should be doing more. The formula happened because first it opened people's hearts, and then encouraged them to learn more, and then to ask themselves, what can I do? So the communications lesson there, in times of overwhelming crisis, human stories like Doa's do cut through the noise. They do speak to our emotions. And just to say, disinformation actors are very good at using human stories. I see in the in the kind of institutional space, that what we do more, I would say regularly, is produce press releases with statistics. We need to get better than that. So that's the first lesson. And the story also, appeals to the best of our instincts when it is told in a way that is captivating. So as social media expanded, we also at the UN, as communicators, I want to give some, say some nice words about social media. We were pretty excited. We were able to reach people far and wide with our information, with our stories, our appeals. We had to adjust the way we communicated, or otherwise people wouldn't click on our posts. Now we have, across the UN system, over 70 million followers, which is good. But as I mentioned, disinformation actors were also becoming masters of the algorithm. And our communication profession, and I'm sure many of you have felt this, was getting harder. We could no longer only communicate through journalists or through public speaking. We had a much bigger challenge on our hands. And I just wanted to give another illustration, because I wanted to tell a personal story of how the dark side of social media really came home to me, but also, I believe, shows and illustrates how the dangerous forces of disinformation are still thriving today. It was not long after I published A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea that I was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. And I was given a clear course of treatment to save my life: chemotherapy, surgery, radiation. Of course, when I got home on my sofa, what did I do? I went online to see what kind of advice could I get around, do I have to get this horrible, grueling treatment? And what came up on Facebook but a group, a page called The Truth About Cancer, with over 1 million followers. And their recommendation: don't treat your cancer with chemotherapy. There are natural remedies that you can use instead, pointing to supplements that they were selling on their website. And fast forward to today, I was shocked to see that that group is still going strong on Facebook and has been reinstated on Twitter, or X, after it was banned for a while during the COVID-19 pandemic, because they had opportunistically shifted to promote the truth about vaccines during the pandemic, to convince people with fake findings to refuse life-saving vaccines and use alternative treatments. The couple were named among the so-called disinformation dozen, which were 12 accounts, according to the Center for Countering Digital Hate, that were behind 65% of COVID anti-vaxxer lies on Facebook and Twitter, a category of social media influencers that some people call merchants of outrage. And merchants because they monetize their lies. In this case, their false narratives around the COVID-19 vaccines that were cooked up mostly in the United States by these individuals and others spread, thanks to social media, all over the world, infecting the minds of millions. One result, when the UN finally was able to deliver vaccines to many parts of Africa, we found that people who used to be very pro-vaccine were refusing to take them. They had been exposed to some of this mis and disinformation online. And they also, according to UNICEF, have stopped getting children immunized against childhood diseases. So the next alarm bell rang just a year later. And this is in another dimension of the UN's work, and that is in the area of peace and security and human rights. In 2017, social media was weaponized to promote the very worst of human nature. And I'm talking about what happened in Myanmar, where a genocidal government, or a government that was run by military, was determined to convince ordinary people to murder, rape, and drive out their fellow citizens. So on a visit to Bangladesh, I met the victims just a while later, Rohingya refugees, women whose babies were torn from their arms and thrown into fires. And what happened later was a UN human rights mission went to Myanmar, and in their report, their findings found that hate speech spread on Facebook, which came pre-installed on mobile phones, played a significant role in perpetrating that violence. So since then, we have seen social media being deployed in many wars. And of course, in wars previous, we always have seen radio stations and television stations used as ways to turn populations against the other. But with these free social media platforms, though, perpetrators have a much more powerful tool. They can penetrate deeply, they can devolve their responsibility, and they can easily dehumanize the enemy and create more fog around atrocities and war crimes. So this is really disturbing, but even for us, the UN is also under attack. We're seeing false allegations spread on social media and on messaging apps, and our peacekeepers being targeted at a speed that they aren't equipped to address. Their safety is being threatened. Our operations are hampered. We did a recent survey that said that 70% of UN peacekeepers felt that carrying out their mission was greatly hampered by disinformation. So, and many were also saying that their safety was compromised. And we have many examples of that where, for example, in Mali, communities were riled up by a bogus letter posted on Facebook, and trust broke down, an uprising ensued, and peacekeepers were hurt. And humanitarian agencies also are facing attacks. And just give you a couple of examples. In Ethiopia, an online disinformation campaign accused the World Food Program of providing food support to local armed groups. The result of this was communities in Tigray blocking WFP trucks that were actually filled with food for their starving population. There's currently a conspiracy circulating in Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Palestine, and most recently in Libya, that WFP's high-energy biscuits contain ingredients that boost children's sexual drives and alter their genetic makeup. These posts are warning parents, don't let your children eat these biscuits at school and on the streets. And we're seeing, of course, wider narratives that are also emerging in the online conspiracy world. We're seeing it seeping in to the area of climate action, blending into the existing narratives that the fossil fuel industry has been trying to promote with their aggressive lobbying to try to delay climate action. Last year, the IPCC report was the first ever to call out climate disinformation, and it blamed a deliberate undermining of science for the misperceptions of the scientific consensus, uncertainty, disregarded risk and urgency, and dissent. So we're seeing the traditional climate disinformation vested interest actors merging with these merchants of outrage. And then added to that, we're seeing governments getting involved in trying to confuse people around climate change to try to get them to think that it doesn't exist, or it is something that is not that is a natural occurrence and shouldn't disturb them. We're seeing on social media the hashtag climate scam circulating. It was most prominent during COP27 last year, where it was at the top of the hashtags. we're seeing it now circulating increasingly today. Also, climate science and activists under attack, with methods becoming increasingly sophisticated. So what we're seeing as a result of this online demonization of activists, painting them as extremists, is that there is a result of vicious attacks, even offline. A recent protester in Germany, climate protester, was almost run down by a truck driver. Videos of that attack that were circulated then online praised the driver for running over the climate activists. There are many more examples of this. So we need to mobilize in a different direction. We're seeing the outrage is as if we were in a town square and only those who were communicating disinformation were given the megaphone, because they do not reflect the population. Most people around the world actually, according to polling, believe in climate change and believe that we need to take action. So we need to mobilize around these people, and we need to produce and be the source of reliable information about climate. We're doing our part at the UN. We have a dedicated news arm. We have a climate campaign. We're shifting our climate, our verified campaign to focus on climate. If you Google climate change right now, hopefully still, UN sources will be at the top. So we're doing what we can to make sure that authoritative information is in people's feeds. But we need your help, and we hope that we can collectively communicate to get people informed and on board to take action so that we can bring the world back from the brink of climate disaster. So one last point, painting the picture of our information environment that disturbs us. I cannot not mention generative AI. In fact, I'm in Copenhagen now with representatives from across the UN system, and we're spending the day on how we can look at using AI for the good of humankind, and at the same time mitigate the risks. It sounds like a conversation that we should have had at the outset of social media, but we are seeing huge leaps in generative AI and huge alarm bells also ringing in the information integrity community. We're concerned about how easy it will be to create sophisticated deep fakes, already is. And we're already seeing mass propaganda being created. We're seeing a study that said that found that there are already 500 AI-generated news sites out there that operate in 14 languages with very little human oversight, that spew out falsehoods that are completely fabricated events and news. So we communicators are in for a rough ride, and the Secretary General of the United Nations very recently made it very clear we cannot go on like this. For years, we have been pushing and advocating to the social media platforms to deliver on their early promises, to also live up to their own standards. And despite the increased focus, including from the entire ecosystem that has been built up in academia, in think tanks, in fact-checking, that is calling for, and many of you, for a more humane internet where facts are more dominant than lies. We're seeing things going in the wrong direction. It's good to hear the AI founders referring to social media's mistakes and calling for regulation before it's too late. But we need to all push for more guardrails and more safety in design. I would like to mention that we are working at the UN on a UN Code of Conduct on information integrity in digital platforms, which we hope to release in the early summer next year. And we hope that this will serve as a kind of UN gold standard for how the internet can be less harmful and more of a place where people's human rights can be enjoyed. So I want to just also, since we're all from the public relations community, communications community, I would be remiss if I didn't touch on our own responsibility. And it's really great to see your code of conduct and what it calls for in the industry, and Steve's words about how we all have a responsibility as communicators. We are believe that we'd like to seek a commitment from as the UN, from the PR industry, to please stop supporting unethical causes, particularly on our continued reliance on fossil fuels. And I'd just like to repeat the call of the Secretary General that he issued a year ago, that we need to hold to account not only the fossil fuel industry, but also their enablers, including the public relations machine that is raking in billions to shield the fossil fuel industry from scrutiny. And he said the time for greenwashing is over. The fossil fuel interests need to spend less time averting a PR disaster and more time averting a planetary one. So if we could all come together and work to avert a planetary disaster in all dimensions, I think the world would be a better place. So please, if we could join forces and help, if you could help us and we can help you, I think we can all communicate for a better world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for an incredibly thought-provoking lecture. And I hope you can see, like I can, the reactions that are coming through at the moment from our group of communicators, particularly that final point you made around greenwashing and our own responsibilities. And I think we're all also incredibly grateful that you've spoken so personally as a communicator and about the pressures of the job and the challenges that you're facing. Before we go to some of the really great questions that have come through, I wanted to ask you a few questions myself. I'm actually going to start with one from a committee member of ours, Tazma, who talked a lot about the kind of the stress and emotional complexities of issues and the crisis work that you're dealing with on a daily basis. And she wanted to get an understanding of how you manage the pressure, the emotional toll, and the advice that you would have for others who are working as communicators in similar spaces to you.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, a lot of my colleagues are working in more harrowing situations than I currently am now in my few steps removed position in New York. But we do get the reports in every day, and many of my colleagues are facing, communicating about atrocities, communicating about human suffering, hunger, malnutrition, war crimes, torture, as in your case, Crispin. And it is actually, hard to take it all in, to try to figure out, okay, how can I also, you put on my professional hat here and figure out how to communicate all of this suffering in a way that is going to reach people and not overwhelm them with maybe some of the feelings I'm feeling myself. And that is sadness, it's disgust, it's outrage, it's anger, and sometimes it's feeling overwhelmed too. And it's our responsibility then to distill, there's a social scientist in the US, Paul Slovic, who's done studies on the arithmetic of compassion. And he has concluded the more who die, the less we care. it's not that people don't want to care. It's just that it is even overwhelming to see two suffering children as opposed to just one, because the reaction is that we feel helpless and hopeless. So maybe we might say, oh my God, this is terrible, but it's too much. And I've noticed often with our own colleagues that they're also feeling like, wow, this is too much. But it is our responsibility to figure out how can we tell those stories in a way that will reach the people who will be able to, in turn, change policies, provide funding, take in an individual refugee perhaps, and help. And that has to be our constant objective. And if we can feel that sense of, I have moved somebody, I have, the result has been more donations or changed policies, then that is what keeps our communicators going.
And in an organization like the UN that's like so massive, there's so much going on, it has a life and a momentum of its own. How do individual communicators, you put a communication out into the world and it kind of, in some ways it just disappears, but how do you then encourage your communicators to see that impact and to get a sense that actually they are shifting the dial a little bit?
Well, I think we put a big emphasis on monitoring our impact. We often are underfunded and don't have the budgets to do the kind of monitoring that we'd like to, but we do what we can to show whether our communications have resulted in media coverage, have resulted in, we don't even monitor impressions on social media. We monitor only engagements, because that means people meaningfully, spend some time with the piece of content. And we have a discussion every week or twice a week on, really looking at what had impact and what didn't, and how can we adjust. If it's a global campaign, we're spending more time, especially out front, testing messaging, which I'm sure you all know and are doing very often, but to see if this is the kind of messaging that will work with our target audiences, getting our colleagues to think about it's communications is not just putting things out into the world and hoping people receive them. It is really having that conversation about who is going to move the needle for you, and have you reached that person in any way? And so it is something that we try to assess and self-diagnose on a constant basis.
And something else, another question that's been put into the chat that I found really kind of interesting, noting that you're sitting in front of the kind of the graphics for the SDGs. Samantha Siwasaran, our international chair, notes the huge amount that the UN's done to promote the SDGs around the world, but wanted to get a sense of how you judge the success of the campaign globally, but also, and I think this is really kind of fundamental, given the complexity of the different messages that you're trying to get out there with the SDGs, how do you communicate with so many different issues on so many different levels to so many different people?
By the way, there's also a conspiracy around the SDGs. So if you wear the pin, you're part of a global cabal that is going to control the world and suppress people's freedoms. And but we're monitoring that. On the positive side, we believe that this was one of the best branding exercises in the history of the United Nations. Contained within the 17 goals are, very, it sounds simple, but even you should have seen what the language was like before it just was distilled into beautiful icons and, and just very simple, no hunger, kind of slogans, which encompass, actually, the beauty of it is that it is simple. It's still hard to remember 17 goals. And it's still, a lot of people still don't understand, but taken that this is a blueprint for a better world in all of its dimensions. It is, I think it's a real success story. Children are being, I was just speaking to a colleague here in Copenhagen about how they are teaching the SDGs. The UN colleagues here are going around to schools all over Copenhagen, all over Denmark and in the Nordics, with a curriculum to teach the SDGs in schools from elementary to high school. And many Scandinavian countries have put it in their national curriculums. If you go to Japan and ride on ANA Airlines, you'll see all the stewardesses are wearing the SDG pins, and you'll see many CEOs wearing them as well. It has become, popularized to such an extent that it is part of the culture, and it's this aspirational, positive goal setting thing. But if you go then at the country level, in developing countries, the SDGs are the framework in government programming, and the whole UN country teams on the ground are working across all SDGs with the governments to try to meaningfully make progress in all of these with clear measurements across the board. So I think there is this kind of aspirational goal, and there are goals for everybody. There's goals for every sector. There are ways you can relate the SDGs to what people care about. And there are ways you can, teach children about how to create a better world around this framework. So I think it's been quite a success.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder to everyone, thank you for the questions that are coming in. Please keep them coming. Melissa's agreed to stay with us until around 1:15, which is fantastic. So we've still got a bit of time. Hopefully I can come to a lot of your questions in the next 20 minutes or so. To help me do that, Melissa, I was going to group together a few questions around misinformation. I think loud and clear, we've heard the scale of the problem. I mean, we're obviously aware of it prior to this, but you've really emphasized the scale of the problem and the breadth of the problem, and how it impacts people on a personal, but also on a kind of governments and organizations on a policy level. But let's spend a bit more time now looking at some of the potential solutions. Michael Chamil from Royal Holloway University of London, academic, he's asking, what kind of evidence outputs or initiatives would you expect from the academic community or educators to help you as a professional communicator make better decisions or understand the problem of fake news? Linked to this, Jane Charlton is saying, how can we help educate people to decipher between fake and real information, and which sources can people trust? And then I also wanted to add in from Steve, from our president, who we heard earlier. He's opening up the idea around regulation and big tech. And I wondered if you could, once you sort of looked at the academic and the kind of the sources, if you could look perhaps, or you talk us through perhaps what you're doing with big tech at the moment to try and tackle that.
Thank you, Crispin. Could you just repeat that second question?
Sure. Sorry, I'm throwing an awful lot at you. So the academics, and then that was the first question. The second one was around sources. How do you educate people to decipher between fake and real information? And I guess underlying that is the fact that what sources can we trust to tell us that a source is reliable?
Absolutely. First of all, the question about the academic community is really, really essential. I've noted that many universities have now created new academic disciplines actually around information integrity, or their colleges of communications, even schools of journalism have a focus on information integrity or combating mis and disinformation, monitoring it, strategic communications departments, how to address it. So I think for our profession, for those who are going through and getting their degrees in communications or journalism, it's incredibly important. Also in the context of our UN Code of Conduct, on information integrity on digital platforms. We are consulting with academia, and we do have I don't know if Royal Holloway is a member of our academic impact group of universities from all over the world, but we can let you know how to get involved. Your question was to help you as a communicator identify fake news. I mean, this is where we're looking now for like how to
or to help us as sorry to interrupt, to help us as professional communicators make better decisions around fake news and to understand.
That's great. I think that this is an area that we need absolutely, we really need help in. How can we, who are representing companies, organizations, institutions that are trying to communicate authoritative information and facts, how can we most effectively do this in a sea of disinformation, and have that information, kind of rise as trusted? What are some of the strategies? Are there any studies that we can point to that we don't have the time to carry out, that will, or could you help, testing a campaign? We had a campaign during COVID-19 called Verified, in which we used trusted messengers to talk about vaccines to their communities. And we asked actually MIT Media Lab to come and study the impact. And they found, after surveying those who had been exposed to our campaign material, that a significant percentage, I don't have it in my head right now, would be more likely to take the vaccine after being exposed to it. So that kind of thing makes it very would be very helpful to us, as well as those coming into the profession. I tried to kind of outline how our profession has evolved since I've been in the business, which has been my whole career. And we need to consistently learn new skills and adapt the way we communicate. And I think this should be taught at universities. To the second question about users, we have a call, that, and this will be included in our code of contact, our code of conduct, that we need to do more to equip and empower internet users. I mean, I think every school should have it for kids in their curriculum. They need to have digital literacy. But people need to be able to think more critically about the content they see. And they have to understand why they are receiving things in their feeds that the algorithms are pushing to them, not because they've asked for it, and not because they're necessarily searching for it, so that they have a more accurate view of the world and not one that is curated for them. Also, I mean, we have now the age of ChatGPT, which I'm sure that all of you have experimented with it. And as all of you have seen, what it spews out seems like very plausible answers, very well written and formulated, with a lot of mistakes. And people need to understand that they cannot trust this 100% or even 70% or even 50%. So also we really believe that people need to understand how their online behavior is being tracked and that their personal data is being sold. The users can then take steps to protect their own privacy. And so, there's a lot. We don't want to put all the onus on users. Absolutely not. It's really not their responsibility, but, failing big steps from the big platforms. And that comes to the next question. We really need to, arm users with this information. And we see the EU Digital Services Act, requiring, and this leads to the third question and touches on both, requiring more transparency around the information that they are collecting on users, but also how their algorithms are working. We believe that this platforms that operate in secrecy, while reaping huge profits are, this isn't really acceptable power dynamic. So the kind of model, I think, for the world in a way, although we're watching to see how it works, for a regulatory effort, could be the EU Digital Services Act. It would not work in every country, but we're really hoping that what the platforms are going to have to do, the large platforms, to comply with the EU Digital Services Act, will have a ripple effect around the world, that they won't just implement it geo-located to Europe, but they will have to provide more transparency in other jurisdictions and put up more guardrails as well. So we are going to be advocating for that. And again, our UN Code of Conduct is designed also to represent the whole world. We will be, there are many countries around the world that have not a single study on harm, online harm, and how this is affecting their publics. We're going to be conducting a global study to really get a sense of what information ecosystems look like around the world. And on that basis, we'll be making our recommendations and hope. I mean, the UN does not have any ability to fine the platforms or to provide any kind of sanctions if they're not compliant, but we do have a moral voice and we do have certain moral authority. And so we're hoping that we will be able to affect some meaningful change.
And I mean, being slightly blunt, I mean, do they listen? I mean, if you phone up, I don't know, Nick Clegg or Meta, or I mean, who everyone on this call will know, but if you phone up the big tech companies, do they answer? I'm sure they engage, but beyond that?
We have regular engagements with the platforms, and we have for years. And in many ways, they've been extremely helpful in helping us to get out our information. Although on Facebook, the UN's content is under a category called civic downranking, which means that an individual's content is much more likely to appear in people's feed than the UN's content. And we have to very often accept, free advertising dollars from them to, ironically, to boost our content to reach the level where would be the normal starting point for an individual. We've been advocating for years with them to just please, just allow the UN, and we're out there for the greater good in terms of providing facts and public health, public guidance. Can we please be at this? Can the field be leveled? So we have tough conversations with all platforms. We have no longer any conversations with X or Twitter. The people who we used to work with on a daily basis on the trust and safety team are no longer employed. So that is a real problem, that to have such an influential platform where we have pretty much no one to turn to. There might be one person we can call. So we do what we can. I think a lot of it is we find a lot of goodwill. There are a lot of good people working for these platforms, a lot of people wanting their platforms to be a source of content for good. So we're working with them and we're doing what we can. And at the same time, governments are very interested, policymakers and others in joining forces with us and making demands that they live up to their own standards.
Thank you. And we must, before we close, talk a bit more about AI. There've been some very good questions in the chat, and I'm frantically have been scrolling through trying to find the questions again. Unfortunately, I can't find the questions, but just to note that several people have asked you about artificial intelligence and particularly kind of how it feeds into misinformation and disinformation. I'd like to know as well how you as an institution can maintain the status as a kind of an impartial expert in the era of deep fakes. I mean, especially given the size of the UN and the time it sometimes takes for the UN to rebut things. And
I mean, we are hugely concerned about not being able, that the public will not be able to distinguish anymore between what is real and what isn't. It already is difficult, but there are ways, to look at to investigate. And we've had a campaign, a media literacy campaign called Pause, Take Care Before You Share, where we educated a lot about how you can identify, where a photograph was taken, for example, or to check the sources of articles. But now with the kind of mass generation of fake news sites, for example, that look at first glance like a newspaper, that leading you back to some site that looks newsy, has some and which is all AI generated with no human being, and is full of falsehoods, that it would take, and deep fakes where it is virtually impossible to distinguish. It will be very difficult to put the onus on users anymore, any onus, because you won't be able to tell. So we are really asking the creators of generative AI, who have come and spoken to us, to please do what you can in your designs. I mean, there is talk of creating watermarks, so users will see, oh, this is AI generated, an AI generated photo, an AI generated video. These are the things that we're extremely concerned about. We're concerned about bad actors, states that have lots of money, being able to weaponize even further disinformation in far reaches of the world, costing them actually much less, and being able to scale much wider and deeper to personalize and penetrate. So it is very worrying and alarming. I'm at a session today full of UN colleagues that are really excited about how AI can help. It can help in many ways across the world, in supercharging their efforts and data in health and in climate and in other areas. So there is a good side to it, but I think we really have to focus on the dangers. And now it is going at a speed that is not UN speed. It is not government speed. It is a speed that is
not human speed.
All of us. Yeah.
Superhuman speed. Okay, thank you. And we're sadly we're kind of coming towards the end of our allotted time, but I love on your podcast at Wake at Night. I mean, perhaps everything we've been talking about is the answer to this question, but at the end of your podcast at Wake at Night, you always ask the UN leader or the humanitarian worker you have across the studio with you what keeps them awake at night. What is it for you that keeps you awake at night?
I think it is this toxic information ecosystem. I think we can only sleep well when we know that we're going to wake up the next day and be in an environment that is healthy and humane. So
thank you. Well, thank you to you, to all your colleagues at the United Nations for what they're doing to try and improve this situation. I think one of the most striking comments that we've had in the remarks was from Kirsty Craig, who said, "Thank you for an extremely inspiring and informative session. Lots to take away from this and thought-provoking content, in a way reassuring that even the UN has the same issues as a small local government comms team in the northeast of Scotland." I think the points that you have raised have clearly resonated with everyone who's been here at the talk today, and I know that we will all take an awful lot away from this. Just as a kind of just a final word from you, you're at the moment, there's an open call for information for the voluntary code of conduct of information integrity on digital platforms that you're putting together. Can you just tell us a little bit about that call?
Thanks, Crispin, for raising that, and we'd welcome any contributions from you. It is un.org/information integrity. We are welcoming contributions for how we can. You'll be guided through it. It shouldn't take too much of your time, or it could take a lot of your time, no matter how, depending on how passionate you are. This will help us in our formulation of the analysis around the report that will be the basis for our recommendations for the UN Global Code of Conduct on Information Integrity. un.org/information integrity. Thanks.
Perfect. And then people have sort of, it's to the end of this year, isn't it, to make submissions?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it's the end of November, but maybe it is the end of this year. But let's say the end of November.
You'll know a lot better than me. So yeah, okay, perfect. And you're working towards this being unveiled, is it next year at the General Assembly?
Yes, we hope that it will be endorsed by next year's General Assembly, which is going to be called the Summit of the Future. But we will be releasing the Code of Conduct ahead of that, early summer, and rolling it out.
Well, perhaps, hopefully we can have you or one of your colleagues back then to tell us more about the Code of Conduct. But for now, thank you so much, Melissa Fleming, United Nations Under Secretary General for Global Communications, for really a genuinely fascinating and highly topical Maggie Nally lecture. Before we go, I should stress that putting on an event like this is always a huge team effort, and it's been something that all the committee, the International Committee at the CIPR, all volunteers have worked on. I'd particularly like to thank Eva McLean, who did so much heavy lifting behind the scenes to ensure that today happened. And also essential behind the scenes were Emma Duke from our committee and Katerina and Geneva from Melissa's office, who've been super patient over the past 6 months with us as we've been organizing this event. So thank you to you all for joining us on this call. A final reminder, if you're not yet a member of the CIPR, please do join. You get to come to wonderful events like this, but also huge opportunities for professional development opportunities and training courses. And you can find lots of information at cipr.co.uk. Thank you all again, and goodbye.